Welcome to In Reality, the podcast about truth, disinformation, and the media. I'm your host, Eric Schoenberg, longtime journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. It's hard to imagine principles more foundational to American self-conception as a free people than the guarantees of free speech and a free press embedded in the First Amendment. Given their importance, it's strange to realize that these principles almost didn't become part of the Constitution. Rights, after all, already existed in state constitutions and centuries of English common law, so many framers didn't think it necessary to write them down. Given how frequently those rights have been challenged since, it's a good thing they did. So, what happened to change their minds? My guest today is Pulitzer Prize winning historian and Stanford professor emeritus, Jack Rakove. The episode is a distilled version of a longer interview covering the origins of the First Amendment, but for this episode, we'll leap right into its adoption into the Constitution. And then we'll take another great leap into whether that Constitution, for all its 18th century brilliance, is up to governing the country we have become today. Rakove has doubts. It's a question I'll explore further this fall when I teach an online course on the First Amendment open to everyone at the University of Chicago's Graham School. You'll find the sign-up link in the show notes. But now, first, here's Jack Rakove. Jack Rakove, welcome to In Reality.
Happy to be here, live from the coast.
It's great to have you. Let's leap over the revolution. The war is over. The king, parliament, and their representatives, their governors, have been kicked out. And now the Americans are left with creating their own constitutions. And the U.S. Constitution is ratified, and it does not mention freedom of press or freedom of speech or freedom of religion and conscience at all. But some state constitutions do. So there's Virginia's Declaration of Rights, and Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all, I think 7 in general, guaranteed some form of freedom of the press and speech. Why? What were they referring? Why did they do it? And did they all mean the same thing, right?
Eric, for starters, you have to think about how would you compare and or distinguish the kinds of declarations of rights that accompanied, I think, 8 of the new constitutions that the revolutionaries adopted during the crisis, the aftermath of the crisis of independence, 1776, 1777, and then finally Massachusetts for particular reasons in 1780, with how one thought about the authority of a declaration or a Bill of Rights in the late 1780s, culminating in the framing of what we now call the Bill of Rights, mostly at the behest of the insistence of James Madison in 1789. So it's important to note, how one thinks about what does it mean to claim or declare or state a right is an independent subject by itself. So if you look at the operative language in the Declarations of Rights from 1776, I think a couple things are worth noting. The first is most of them were not actually constitutional texts in the full, strict, straight sense of the term, meaning, in fact, they provided a principal basis for asserting the right of self-government, meaning the right to form one's own governments. But they were parallel documents. Now, the two exceptions here are Pennsylvania in 1776 and Massachusetts in 1780. So those two states are, let's say, forward-looking or progressive in the sense of saying their constitutions were divided into 2 parts. One would be called, in effect, the framework of government, the actual architecture defined institutionally. How many branches, endowed with what powers, and so on. And then there's the Statement of Rights. But even then, the language used the second point I want to make here is the language used tend to be more, let's say, monitory instead of commanding, meaning you're affirming principle. The operative verb typically was ought. These are principles that ought to be followed, and adhered to by both the manifestations of power, officers of government, officers of state, those in a position to, draft, execute, adjudicate law, but the citizens themselves ought to be informed of.
Uh-huh. Are these principles applied both to the governed and the governors.
Right, right. So they are, yeah. So I think thinking of them more as, in a sense, as affirmations of principle as opposed to what might be called black letter legal commands. They were not fully invested in the idea, not yet, of thinking of a Bill of Rights as an explicit source of legal authority. There was a whole common law tradition of what what rights were. Many of the articles you'll find in the Declarations of Rights going back to 1776 were basically affirmations of common law principles, which already were part of the legal landscape. And it's not clear that an orthodox Anglo-American legal thinker, particularly an American legal thinker, would have said you really need to, in effect, embed those textually. It's good to have them. It's good to be reminded of them. It's good that people know that they're there so that they know what their rights are. They may want to act politically in defense of their rights because these statements exist, which is different from going to court to sue for their enforcement in the way that, active litigation in the United States, certainly since the early 19th century, especially the 20th century, has tried to do.
So, Jack, what I'm hearing you say is that the belief in the existence of these rights and their worthiness and their kind of permeation through all kinds of Anglo-American law was so obvious to most of the signers of the Constitution that they didn't feel a need to enumerate them in a Bill of Rights. And yet that changed. What happened?
Well, what happens is, Constitution is subject to public debate. The rule of ratification was it had to be approved by 9 of the 13 states. The framers said there's no real need for it. We needed it back in 1776 as part of that constitution-making process, not as a constitutional document in the full sense of the term per se, but as part of the transition from royal rule or imperial rule to republican government, relying on constitutions drafted by groups that are directly representative of the people themselves. There's no real need for it. But then, of course, once the Constitution comes under debate, and particularly starting with Massachusetts, which was the first state where there actually was a serious, the ratification convention was closely divided, and so the Federals have to kind of agree to a kind of package deal to start agreeing. Okay, we will, we will start proposing amendments to the Constitution. And so the idea of adding Bill of Rights to confirm that all those venerable rights would be secure against the so-called consolidated government that the new federal government would represent became more persuasive. It's worth noting here. This is a point, Eric, that I think people often miss. Is part of James Madison's political strategy. And I think Madison really is the dominant figure here, 1787, 88, 89, was that it was fine to allow the states to propose amendments, the state ratification conventions, to propose amendments. But you cannot make their approval of the Constitution contingent upon a prior confirmation of the amendments they wanted. Madison really dreaded, and I think with good reason, the idea of having a second convention. At a second convention, you don't know what would happen. I mean, it could well be that now, the delegates to the Constitution Convention they had very few instructions, really was an open field for discussion and debate. If you had a second convention, your delegations would probably come back shackled or at least, bound with a set of instructions from their constituents in the state legislatures as to how they were supposed to act. So Madison is a kind of grand constitutional strategist, which he was. Thought that would be a terrible mistake. So Madison was very comfortable with the idea that the states should be free to propose amendments, but they would only be considered subsequently, could not have a second convention. So they would have to be considered by the new Congress once the government was once the Constitution was safely ratified and the government was up and running. So that's really an important point to keep in mind here. When you look at the amendments, they do come in two forms. I mean, a lot of them do in fact anticipate the 8 amendments that we came to call the Bill of Rights. Some people use that term then, but somewhat ambiguously. Madison was adamantly opposed to, but the other Federalists were too, to doing anything that changed the Constitution in any structural sense. But they're certainly open to the idea of having rights, what we call Bill of Rights, of having rights protecting amendments. But Madison was really the only one. I think without Madison, we wouldn't have had the whole thing.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes. It sounds as though Madison comes across in your work and in other historians' work as this consummate politician. And what I'm hearing you say is that the Bill of Rights it arose as almost a political compromise, that there are many states that wanted this kind of statement of rights, and the idea that they could then propose them made the Constitution as it was signed in 1787 a lot more palatable. It's kind of the first example of a United States sort of governing body making a compromise, rather than the Bill of Rights being kind of the idea that there would be rights embedded in the Constitution as there were rights stated in the opening statements of the Declaration of Independence as being fundamental to the way the government would be shaped.
Yeah, I think he wasn't convinced they were absolutely necessary. And anyone listening to this program who wants to parse Madison's deepest thoughts on the subject should read his letter of October 17th, 1788 to Thomas Jefferson. It's readily available. It's a brilliant document.
What did he say?
Well, it lays out a bunch of things. It lays out his concerns. It expresses his residual reservations. It offers his. I actually have it open right next to me. Coincidentally, I was quoting it for another purpose at work I was doing last night. So if you want, I can read the whole text to you, but I don't think that's part of your program. I think it's important to know, look, when I explain this, and I've done this obviously on numerous occasions, I think there are at least 3 points that are worth making. Go back to what I said at the very beginning. I think Madison understood that instead of having this conception of rights that were derived from multiple sources, you might say divinity, you might say English common law, you might say colonial charters, you might say the examples of parliamentary jurisprudence, you might say the Parliamentary Declaration of Rights from 1688, 1689, and so on. And Madison said, well, look, we could resolve the question of ambiguity by incorporating a Bill of Rights in a constitution, a written text adopted at a fixed moment of historical time, which would henceforth be regarded as the supreme fundamental law of the land. So all those questions about whatever ambiguity arose on the question of how do we derive rights, where do they come from, are they natural, are they divine, are they customary, and so on and so on. In a sense, you can resolve those. You're going to write a constitution now. It's going to be ratified by special procedures, which will make it supreme fundamental law, superior to other forms of law. So why not incorporate the rights right in the text or as supplemental articles to it? So that's in that sense, you've kind of solved one kind of problem, but you have actually opened up two others. The obvious one is the Ninth Amendment problem. The enumeration of this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. I love the language to deny or disparage, which has a nice rhetorical ring. So the idea here is if you're going to treat constitutions now as the supreme source of rights, what happens to other rights that maybe are too controversial to adopt or that we don't fully recognize now or we might become more aware of down the road? And actually, I'm also working today, reading a couple articles relating to the Dobbs versus the Women's Health Organization in Mississippi. I've been reading, some work relating to that, which gets into these same sensitive issues. So there is this Ninth Amendment question. What happens if, the argument against having a right to abortion is, well, it's nowhere there in the text. Is the Ninth Amendment strong enough to sustain it? You could make arguments on that basis, but basically the Ninth Amendment, on the one hand, it's a dead letter. There is hardly any jurisprudence in the Ninth Amendment, but it does address a real problem. Other rights may well exist. And if they're not explicitly incorporated in the text of the Constitution, does that mean you're relegating them to some inferior, lesser status? They may be just as important. I mean, if you want to take another modern example, move beyond abortion. Just say, how about a right to health care? I mean, Americans are, we're we're still having these terrible political debates about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. But, the idea, I think in a certain normal level, the idea that everyone should have access to a hospital and, in an emergency situation, whoever's going to pay for it in the end, why is that not a fundamental right that, you ought to assume? So that's one article. The second thing that I think Madison was worried about is, and which I think I'm the only person, well, maybe not the only one, but which I care about more than some others, is the problem of textualization, right? What is it? So in other words, well, the problem is, what does it mean to declare a right? I mean, literally, to declare a right, you have to write it down. RIGHT and WRITE are, in this sense, complementary aspects of the process. And Madison, who was deeply committed, going back to his youth, I think Madison's own starting position in terms of political thinking was his commitment to the free exercise of religion, which was his one major contribution to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, going back to 1776. It was his first legislative achievement, but something I think he remained deeply proud of. I think Madison, and another point here is actually, let's go back to the politics. I think one reason that Madison wanted to take the initiative in terms of pushing this whole story forward was that Madison had political supporters among the Baptist community, the main dissenting communities in Virginia, I suppose, would have been the Baptists and maybe to some extent the Presbyterians. Madison had his own political motives, and of course, the Baptists were, they had been prosecuted, and Madison had been back in 1776. They just go out preaching according to the dictates of their own conscience, in defiance of the law requiring preachers to register, or whatever Virginia statutes provided. So, but Madison said, look, if you have a controversial right, you might have to water it down. It might be better to leave it. If you're confident that there are other resources available in the political system, they're going to work to protect it over the long run. In a sense, you might sell your position short. I mean, think of the problems we have because of the language of the Second Amendment. Something else I'm working on pretty actively. So Madison had two concerns there.
Yeah, I get it. That kind of explains why he was reluctant to, I guess, include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Now, Jack, I'm going to ask you to move up to the current era and refocusing on freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of speech. We're at a moment when the president calls journalists enemies of the people, when some of the latter Supreme Court rulings on the meaning of the First Amendment, like Sullivan versus New York Times, that was a very liberating ruling about how journalists can behave, that is now under explicit threat from one of the Supreme Court justices. Social media platforms, a technology that could not have been envisioned by Madison or any of his contemporaries, now spreading misinformation at a unimaginable scale. So where do you think the founders would have come down on these, the latter day applications of the First Amendment and the current challenges to it?
Well, I have two starting positions here, Eric. The first is, I think that generation were deeply empirical thinkers. And to some extent, I think it's hard to project their views without their having the same information that we have. I mean, they were quite aware of and I'll reinforce this point by saying they were quite aware of the novelty of what they were doing. They were quite aware of the experimental nature of this whole constitution making process. And if it's experimental, that means you're going to learn on the basis of your own experience. And I think, the standard accountants, been on my mind recently because you probably know Gordon Wood died, sadly, the great historian of constitution making in the Revolutionary period in this kind of freak automobile accident about 6-7 weeks ago. And I'm editing some of his work for a final, for a final book of questions, essays. So that whole experiential process made them deeply self-conscious about what they were doing. Self-conscious in the sense of being self-critical, not in the sense of having a struggle session under a communist regime, but, thinking and rethinking their experiences. And so I think in that sense, there's a limit to what one can do. I happen to think, and it goes back to my prior position and my particular affiliation with Madison, who I sometimes describe as my alter ego. at least in a limited sense of the term. I mean, I do think, and I argue this in my book on, free exercise of religion, but I do think that Madison had discovered certain universal truths, which I think really should apply to all religions, which is a very presumptuous statement on my part on his behalf. So I think there are at some level of, on particular issues, I am comfortable applying late 18th century opinions. Some of them are actually rooted in John Locke, too. But in this other realm, it's a bit like the Second Amendment. It's crazy to apply ideas about firearms in the late 18th century to the world of firearms we inhabit today. And that's the complete and utter foolishness right here. I like to use the Yiddish word, the complete and utter Narishkeit, if you know it, utter foolishness that surrounds Second Amendment jurisprudence. So that's my first main point. The second main point is in a lot of the work I actually have been lecturing on this. Actually, I lectured on this in Chicago at UIC. My dad's old school. I have a paper called "A Theory of Constitutional Failure: The American Case." I do think we are actually in a condition of constitutional failure, not just a constitutional crisis. I think we are actually in a situation of constitutional failure. So to act as if the normal constraints or our normal system of checks and balances, including the courts, are there in place, functioning as they should be, functioning responsibly. I do think as I think about this, I think responsibility, a term we don't talk about very much, is actually a key political factor. So it's tied in with the notion of why do we have a unitary presidency? Why is the executive power vested in the president of the United States, a single person? I think, unlike Chief Justice John Roberts, it's responsibility to make sure that the laws be faithfully executed should be the dominant value of our constitutional government. But that's not the situation we're in. We have the least responsible person who's ever held public office in the United States at any level. I mean, Trump is a person who's, intellectually, psychologically, emotionally, and constitutionally incapable of accepting responsibility for anything. It's always somebody else's fault. Even when he can't get the date straight, it's who was in office in 2020 and who was not. So I have those big concerns. But I'll just say the last point I'll make here is, the corresponding argument that applies to what I call constitutional failure is what's called democratic backsliding or democratic decay. I mean, those terms are actually much more commonly discussed than my specific sense of constitutional failure. All democratic systems, all constitutional systems of government as we think of them, depend upon deliberation. They depend upon, and that depends on the maintenance of certain norms of behavior and conduct, which are essential for deliberations to take place. And I think, if you look at congressional behavior, that's why you always address the speaker, and you can make obscure reference to other members of Congress, but they have to be veiled and muted. There are rules of deliberation and public norms of behavior. And again, Trump being a sui generis figure, being so many standard deviations away from any acceptable norm of political behavior in American history. Trump's vulgarity, and I mean this literally, his notions of insulting, his deprecation of his predecessors. All of these things are destructive of deliberation. So, Eric, I'm not answering your question too directly, but I think at a principled level, I mean, the way to think about this, let's say at a basic normative level, is to repair the system, to make it work. You have to respect the norms of deliberation. And the more they're abused, because of the lack of responsibility that office holders feel towards their constitutional duties, the worse the worse shape we're in. So I want to retreat to a higher level of normative behavior. So I mean and of course the proliferation of media and social channels, and the difficulty of and you look at the vulgarization of X, formerly Twitter. I mean, I'm still on Twitter mostly because there are a few people there I hardly ever, almost never contribute to it. There's still a few people there I want to follow. They're mostly Israelis, who aren't invested in our disputes. And there's they have some good reporting that I don't get in Blue Sky. which I think for academics like me is just so. I've been known to skeet, but I no longer tweet.
Yeah. So, Jack, I will take your answer to this question as being that it's an impossible question to answer because the founders would have expected norms to be adhered to. And we're unfortunately, as you put it, several standard deviations beyond adherence to norms. But I think that is a really valuable insight to make about it. And hopefully it won't be in the too distant future that this tide will begin to recede. Let's hope. Anyway, I do appreciate your time and your wisdom and your scholarship on this. It's been a really fascinating conversation. We got a chance to go deep. I really appreciate it, Jack.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Professor Rakove for joining the show. Any study of history leads to marveling how things that, in hindsight, look foreordained came close to never happening. And so it is with the First Amendment. It emerged from clever politicking by James Madison, who saw the need to secure the Constitution first and improve it afterwards. Also, the rarely invoked Ninth Amendment. That raises a question we still haven't fully answered. Are there rights not named in the Constitution that are as fundamental as those that are? In Reality is a production of the Alliance for Trust in Media, thanks to producer Tom Platts of Sound Sapien and production assistant Kiki Patrick. And thank you for listening. If you like our work, give us a like and subscribe, and see you in a couple of weeks.